Hello and welcome to Global Eye. I'm Parikshit Luthra. On the 22nd of May, UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak surprised the country, calling for early general elections in less than 2 months. Now is the moment for Britain to choose its future, he said, ending months of speculation. Soaked in rain, Sunak made the big announcement outside his 10 Downing Street residence. The UK Prime Minister said he will fight for every vote to prove that only a Conservative government led by him can bring economic stability to Britain. Soon after the announcement, Rishi Sunak and his Labour Party opponent Keir Starmer hit the campaign trail. At an event, Starmer said that only Labour Party can stop the chaos. He also said his party is only making commitments they know they can fulfill. Meanwhile, the Joint Committee on the National Security Strategy has written to Rishi Sunak expressing concerns about threats to the election. The committee says the UK government should be prepared for the possibility of foreign interference during the upcoming general election. This could include cyber attacks or other activity. Joining me now to take this discussion forward is Nigel Fletcher, political historian at King's College London, and Beth Mann, spokesperson of YouGov.uk. Beth, let me begin by asking you, now that the elections have been called by Rishi Sunak, where do his popularity ratings stand? It seems that Sunak believes that the economic recovery could improve the chances of the Conservative Party. But what do your latest polls actually say?
Well, they certainly don't suggest that so far. Currently, Rishi Sunak is very unpopular. We have 70% saying they have an unfavourable opinion of him, and that's been like that for a long time now. And if we look at voting intention, the Conservatives really don't seem on track to win. Labour, the opposition, have a huge majority, a 25-point lead, and that lead has been sustained for a year and a half now, and it hasn't shown any sign of changing since the election's been announced.
Right. Let me go across to Professor Nigel. Professor Nigel, it was widely believed, even within the Conservatives, that this would be an autumn election in the UK. But this has now been preponed to the 4th of July. It seems there is some confusion as to why this happened, and many are upset with Rishi Sunak itself. But there must be a circle of advisors who felt that this is a better chance. Do you think this could in any way improve the chances of the Conservatives at all?
Well, I think what it reflects is that they've come to the conclusion that things were not going to get any better. The reason that people thought that they might play it long and go towards the autumn, or even as late as the end of the year, the latest it could be was January of next year. The reason that people thought they might play it as long as that was because things have been so bad for them. You've just heard from Beth there that the polls are absolutely terrible for the Conservatives. And so there was a view that perhaps things couldn't get any worse, and the only way for them was to go up, that they might get better with some better economic news, perhaps, with people starting to feel a bit more better off as you went through the year. That might help. But I think they've come to the conclusion that there is probably more of a risk that things would get worse as the year went on. But it's a little bit puzzling why he's chosen July. There was some speculation earlier in the year that if he wanted to go early, he could have had it in May at the same time as the local elections that took place across the UK. So no one was really expecting it to be on this date. But I think it seems to reflect a conclusion that this really is as good as it's going to get for the Conservatives. And as we've just heard, that's not very good at all.
All right. Beth, returning to you now, in terms of the key issues important for the voters in the UK, how do they think the Conservatives have performed when it comes to economy? Rishi Sunak's government is saying that the inflation rate has come down significantly. They're out of recession. Are these things being seen positively by voters in your polls or not at all?
Again, unfortunately not. And the economy is something that people do typically look at the Conservatives to be good at handling. But over the last year and a half, last 2 years, there has been nothing positive seen in the population's eyes. We're seeing people saying they're handling the economy badly, health really badly, immigration badly, housing. In fact, there's not really an issue that people see that they're handling well. And as you can see, they are the concerns that people are looking at them to solve. And I think that's why the polls are showing what they're showing, because they're looking at the Conservatives and saying they're not handling any of these well. And they're hoping that change in government might mean a change in direction and hopefully some hope for them on the issues they care about.
Right. Professor Nigel, coming back to you, what do you think will be the Labour Party's alternative that they will offer in terms of the economic footprint, the economic roadmap and blueprint for the UK economy?
Well, I think what Labour are offering, first and foremost, is reassurance. They've been very clear in recent months and indeed in recent years that they're not going to promise to spend large amounts of money. They recognise the fact that the economy has not been in a good place. And they've been very keen to convince voters that they're exercising the sort of fiscal discipline that, frankly, they didn't have under Jeremy Corbyn, the previous leader, who was seen as being someone who was much more careless about the public finances, who wasn't trusted by voters on those issues. With the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, in post, she has kept an iron grip on spending commitments and tried to convince voters that she will manage the economy in a very robust way. It's always been a problem for Labour governments in the past and for the Labour Party that they have always had this weakness on the economy. And so the fact that, as we've just heard, the Conservatives have lost that advantage is a significant moment. And it does make their prospects of winning the election that much greater. It's one of the significant factors underlining their support. Whether they'll find things more tricky in government is another matter, but they are first and foremost offering the slogan of change, but at the same time they're convincing voters that they're not going to be extreme, they're not going to take reckless risks with the economy, and they're pointing people back to what happened 2 years ago under the very brief premiership of Liz Truss. And that was something which harmed the Conservatives' prospects and looks to have completely annihilated their reputation for financial competence.
Right. Beth, returning to your polls at YouGov, when it comes to the popularity of Keir Starmer, you say that his popularity isn't very great either, but people see him as a better prime ministerial candidate. What are his ratings right now as a leader, as a prime ministerial face compared to Rishi Sunak?
Yeah, so his favourability isn't as low as Sunak's. I wouldn't say he was popular. We still have 50% having an unfavourable opinion of him. And when we do ask specifically, is Keir Starmer ready for being Prime Minister, we still find people quite split and actually leaning towards no. And yet they do think it's very likely that he will be Prime Minister. And if you look at the favourability of the Labour Party in general, that is better than Starmer's. So it's perhaps not that people are voting for the Labour Party because they see him as a good leader, but because they want the Labour Party more generally and want what they stand for and want that change.
Right. Professor Nigel, when it comes to the approach towards India, interestingly, last year we had seen the Indian government actually reach out to the Labour Party to discuss the FTA. And in a way, within Indian quarters, there was actually no worry about the FTA getting delayed because there was some hope that they might get a better deal with the Labour Party. Could that be true?
Well, I have to say that's sort of outside my my area of expertise. But one thing that it does show is that when a party is as far ahead as the Labour Party is, you do start seeing people recognising them as the next government, and that's been the case for a long time. And we've seen governments around the world actually starting to put out the feelers to talk to the Labour Party, and they've been very keen to talk to them in the expectation that they will be the government. And so that does change the way the party behaves. It makes them much more focused on the fact that they are going to have to look at challenges like this. And of course, as you say, around the world, other governments will be looking not at the internal politics of the UK and analysing every bit of the election. What they'll be interested in is what is the Labour government going to do for them in future. But it's quite telling that that is the way people are thinking, and it's the way they've been thinking for some time.
Right. Beth, returning to you, what is the #1 issue, according to the people that you have surveyed and spoken to? What would be some of the top 2 or 3 issues that you've come across?
Yeah, so we actually regularly ask the people of Britain what their top 3 issues at the moment are. And consistently, the economy and health are coming up top. And at the moment, immigration is a really big one. It is slightly different when you look at Conservatives versus typically Labour voters. The Conservatives really are focusing on immigration at the moment. And Labour tend to think things like housing and the environment are important. So it will matter which ones the leaders are focusing on. But the economy and health is something that unites the electorate across Britain.
All right, Beth and Professor Fletcher, thank you very much for joining us on Global Eye, giving us your view on where we stand with the UK election. It's definitely a poll we'll be watching out very closely for. And India, of course, in the middle of its election process and 10 days for counting in India. Thank you very much, Professor Nigel and Beth, for joining us once again. We're heading into a short break right now on Global Eye, but coming up in a major ruling that has a global impact, the International Court of Justice has ordered Israel to halt its attack on Rafah. A discussion with former diplomat KP Fabian and human rights lawyer Lissandra Novo when we return. Welcome back. In a major ruling that has a global impact, the International Court of Justice has ordered Israel to halt its attack on Rafah. In its ruling, the World Court said it was not convinced that the evacuation of Rafah and other measures by Israel are sufficient to alleviate the suffering of Palestinians. Israel has been ordered by the International Court of Justice to open the Rafah border crossing for humanitarian assistance. It has also ordered Israel to allow access to the Gaza Strip for investigators. The ICJ told Israel that it must submit a report on measures taken within 1 month. On Monday, the ICC's prosecutor's office requested arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his defense chief YouGov Gallant, as well as for 3 Hamas leaders for alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity. The ruling against Israel could damage the country's international reputation, but the important question is, can ICJ rulings be enforced? In March 22, the court had ordered Russia to immediately halt its military campaign in Ukraine, which Russia did not abide by. To understand the impact of the ruling, we're joined by former diplomat KP Fabian and human rights lawyer Lissandra Novo, who has experience working at the International Court of Justice. Lissandra, let me begin by asking you, do you think these measures, including asking Israel to halt the Rafah offensive immediately and allow humanitarian assistance to pass, will this have any impact on Israel, even though it may not go ahead and implement the order?
I think that's a great question, and in great part depends on the international community's response. As you noted, the International Court of Justice doesn't have its own enforcement mechanism. When there is a question about enforcement, this can be elevated to the United Nations Security Council. But of course, with the United States as a permanent member, it's unlikely to have any result. However, this order by the court is legally binding on Israel. And therefore, if it does not comply, it's in breach of an international obligation. And that should really compel states that are giving it assistance to rethink their approach to how they want to support Israel as this conflict continues.
Right. Let me also get in Ambassador Fabian, somebody who tracks the Middle East very closely. Ambassador Fabian, the court, the ICJ, has said that Israel must allow investigators to enter Gaza, and evacuation efforts in Gaza are not sufficient. The situation in Rafah is absolutely disastrous. A few days ago, you had the International Criminal Court's prosecutor seeking arrest warrants against Hamas and Netanyahu. Before that, you had the likes of Norway, Spain, recognizing Palestine as a country. How do you think all these measures put together put pressure on Israel and also on the likes of the United States, which have been backing Israel in its every endeavor?
Thank you. Glad to be with the Global Eye. I agree with Lysandra that the ICJ has no enforcement mechanism, and the matter can be brought to the Security Council, and we know what the United States will do. But it's also possible for the matter to be then taken to the General Assembly. Again, the General Assembly will pass a resolution which again can't be enforced. But the key point made by her is that the political pressure will increase exponentially. And that is important. And just one more point. The court said not only should Israel halt its operations, but withdraw from the enclave. That's very important. And as you mentioned, the court has ordered Israel to give access to for a fact-finding mission and all that, but also for for humanitarian assistance to go there. And it has given Israel 1 month, which I think is not justified. After all, human beings are getting killed. So why 1 month? I would say that the court has given the correct judgment, but it has taken a lot of time. Remember, South Africa took the matter to the court in December last year. So, court has done the right thing, but rather late. But let us see what happens, because Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu is hell-bent on doing what he wants to do, primarily because if the war ends, he might find himself in jail within a couple of days. And President Biden lacks the authority, he lacks the responsibility to use his presidential authority.
Important points there, Ambassador Fabian. Let me go back to Lysandra as well. Now, Lysandra, as far as the powers of these two courts is concerned, International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, tell us, what is the real difference between the enforcement powers? The Office of the Prosecutor at the ICC has sought arrest warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu and other Hamas leaders. What really happens next in this case?
Thank you for asking that. I think this is really a big misunderstanding that people have between these two courts. So the International Court of Justice is a court between states. And that's why it's South Africa that has brought this case rather than individuals. And what the International Court of Justice does is it finds when states are in breach of their international obligations. It is not a criminal court, and it cannot sentence anyone or find anyone criminally responsible. And it won't even find a state criminally responsible, right? There's a big difference between being responsible for violating a treaty obligation, such as those under the Genocide Convention, and being criminally responsible. Now, the International Criminal Court is a court of individual criminal responsibility. And so its job is really to investigate alleged crimes and to assess whether particular individuals are responsible for having committed these crimes. And as you mentioned, the Office of the Prosecutor has requested arrest warrants. This does not mean that they have been issued. The pretrial chamber has to now consider the request that has been put forth by the prosecutor and decide whether the standard has been met to issue the arrest warrants. At this particular stage, that standard is reasonable grounds to believe, which means that a reasonable person would believe that maybe the people that have been accused could have committed these crimes and an investigation is warranted. However, the ICC, like the ICJ, also does not have its own enforcement mechanism. It depends on the states parties to the Rome Statute. And in this case, even if the pretrial chamber does approve the request and does issue warrants for the Israeli leaders and for the Hamas leaders that the prosecutor has requested these warrants for, really their only enforcement is if these particular individuals travel to countries that are bound by the court to enforce these warrants and detain them. So for the case of Israel, for example, most European states would be bound as parties to the Rome Statute to arrest Netanyahu or the defense leader that the warrant has been requested for if they travel. However, the United States is not a party to the Rome Statute, and therefore the United States is not under any legal obligation to arrest these individuals. When it comes to the leaders for Hamas, for example, one of them is situated in Qatar, which is not a party to the Rome Statute, and therefore they can travel to this state as well without any repercussions, even if the trial chamber approves the warrants.
So that's important. It'll become difficult for Netanyahu to travel to states which accept the jurisdiction of the ICC in case the court, the criminal court, issues an arrest warrant against Netanyahu and other Hamas leaders. Ambassador Fabian, coming to you. We have Biden and the U.S. Secretary of State actually agreeing with U.S. lawmakers to say that we will look at legislations where we can put sanctions on the ICC. How do you see this move by the United States? Do you think it's unprecedented and it really derails international law in one sense?
No, I believe in the past, Trump had put some sanctions and Biden sort of, lifted them. So this is not unprecedented. But what we have to recognize is that in Washington, they seem to believe that for every situation, there is one panacea, that is sanctions. Now, I'm afraid that proposition needs examination. If you sanction ICC officials, even the judges, well, that means they cannot come to the United States, or if they have any funds there, those funds can be frozen. But now they have to remove the funds and they will not be coming to the United States. So it's an empty gesture just to take care of, public opinion. That gives the impression that we are acting.
Right, just to give an impression that we're acting. Coming to you, Lisandra, what are some of the other legal steps that can be taken by countries who are absolutely against what United States is doing, what Israel is doing in Gaza? Can international aid agencies and bodies approach any other jurisdiction to put pressure on Israel or Hamas for that matter?
That's a complicated question. I think it really depends on the specifics of what you're looking at. But one thing that many states can do, and these are typically the same states that are party to the Rome Statute and to the International Criminal Court, is they can exercise something that's known as universal jurisdiction. And that is when a domestic court in a country starts an investigation or a prosecution over international crimes, such as, for example, war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide, no matter where they've been committed or by whom. There have been famous instances of universal jurisdiction cases in the past. One is open right now in Argentina, for example, on the Myanmar situation. Europe has held several European countries. Germany prolifically has had a lot of trials related to the conflict in Syria. And so depending on the particular requirements of these countries, for example, some require perpetrators to travel there, they could start cases against either Israeli leaders or Hamas leaders present on their territory for some of these crimes. Now, international organizations aren't really built to deal with accountability. I think they can really assist in issuing political pressure, but it's hard for them to deal with the current situation that we're facing. However, states can support these organizations. They can support humanitarian organizations seeking to get aid into Rafah, into other parts of Gaza. They can try to demand
Right.
that these organizations get better access, not just at these checkpoints, but once inside the territory to deliver it where it's greatly needed.
Right. Thank you very much, Lysandra, for joining us. And I'd like to thank Ambassador Fabian as well. One thing is for sure, as both our panelists pointing out, that this definitely puts more political pressure on Israel. Let's see what happens in the days to come. There's also some more important development coming in, and this is with regard to the Russia-Ukraine war. According to a Reuters report, Russian President Putin is ready to halt the war in Ukraine with a negotiated ceasefire that recognizes the current battlefield lines. The report quotes 4 Russian sources who said Putin is also prepared to fight on if Kyiv and the West do not respond. So that leaves us with a lot to think about over the weekend. Let's see if this really paves the way for the war in Ukraine, at least one war in the world, to come to an end. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of Global Eye. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned to CNBC-TV18. The news continues on the other side.